Today I'm I'm going to be reading Joshua L's claim about how gun control fails to prevent crime, even though I personally believe that gun control does not control or prevent crime, but his data is so out of date that's made his evidence and his subclaims to be unreliable. Well, not unreliable, but not easy to. You couldn't believe them. His subclaims were gun control doesn't prevent criminals from acquiring guns. His second claim was most gun-related offenders and victims had some sort of criminal record. And his final claim was gun control states or districts don't have a lower crime rate than uncontrolled states. In his first subclaim was gun control does not prevent criminals from acquiring guns. And one of his evidence was that only 23,775 guns have been reported missing or stolen since 1994 to 2008. And since we're no longer in that, I went from the FFL, which is the the federal firearm licensees, and I went to one of their websites which told me the theft and loss reports of the years of 2008 to 2010, and they said that their number for firearms lost or stolen was 74,105. So that's more recent data, and it makes you realize that the gun control doesn't prevent them from acquiring guns. They can steal whenever they want to, and also they also said that there is 83% of their inventory was also lost or stolen, and there was 90 cases filed, but only 83 were for sure. His second claim was that most gun-related offenders and victims had some sort of criminal backgrounds, but actually when you look on to the Federal Bureau of Justice, it says that upon sentencing, 22.3% of state inmates were actually first-time offenders, while reconvicted felons were actually only 17.2% of inmates. So that shows that actually first-time offenders are the ones who actually have been arrested for possession of guns. Also in that it said violent offenders who had served a prior sentence and first-time violent offenders were about equal likely to carry the gun, but the first offenders were more likely to use it. His third and final claim was gun control states or districts did not have a lower rate than uncontrolled states. He said that Washington gun control had a high homicide rate that skyrocketed in 1991. And if we look at the murder rate with firearms in Washington, it was actually a 1.1 out of 100,000 people were the people who were killed with guns, and 21.43 were out of robberies, and 24.87 were out of assault. So technically the murder rate was actually down. And then he also stated in Florida that the murder rate has dropped, yet he didn't mention the things that are going on in robbery and in assault, because while in Florida, the gun control was not as more onto the people, so murder rate was unreported, but there was 59 out of the 100,000 people who used guns during robbery, and there were 71.18 people out of the 100,000 that used it in assault. So technically the gun control states and districts did have a lower crime rate, but it didn't have the lower murder rate. So I say that Joshua's data was out of date, and if he had more recent data, he would have had better subclaims that would make you believe that gun control failed to prevent crimes.
All right, well, you start off, I think that you might want to be careful about trying to concede that you already accept the premise that the advocate is presenting in your own personal point of view. That's not necessary, that would be like if I was the defense attorney and said, well, yeah, I think he's guilty of sin, but let me tell you why he's not. That doesn't make any sense. It's not required of you to take a position on this. The purpose of the arguments that we're presenting is not, it doesn't matter what your personal point of view is. Have you found the arguments on the other side? That's what we're looking at, and I think if you stick to that, you'll be better off. On the first point, you've got more updated evidence, you've got more recent statistics, it sounds more dramatic. I'm just not sure what inference was being drawn either by the advocate or by you in this particular situation. So, because there's 74,000 guns missing in the last 2 years, or in the most recent data, as composed to only 23,000 in the data that the advocate was using. So what does that prove? What inference am I supposed to draw from that? That the current gun control laws are inadequate because people are still stealing guns, or that they can't work because people steal guns? I didn't think that there was a very clear explanation here as to why I'm listening to those numbers, and that's problematic because you spend a lot of time on those numbers on that particular point. The same thing is true on the second point. It seems like you're presenting this argument that says that 22% of the people who are going into prison are first-timers, and 17% of them are reconvicted, and the ones who are first-timers were more likely to use the guns. Okay, so how does that affect the argument that the advocate presented? Does that mean that the presence of a gun made it more dangerous or less dangerous, that the laws worked or that they didn't work? I can tell that you've got a point here that responds to the advocate's point. I just don't know why it matters, and that's the problem with most of those arguments. The last one, for instance, I think you are trying to make an argument that says Washington, which has restrictive gun laws compared to Florida, if you look at more contemporary data, Washington's murder rate is in fact lower, and so the gun control law must be working there. But the way the statistics get presented is not very clear, and sometimes, for instance, you give the murder rate in Washington, and you don't really tell us what the murder rate is in Florida. It's 1 death by murder per every 100,000 persons in Washington, and I didn't get what the exact murder rate was in Florida, but I did get what the assault rate was and what the armed robbery rates were. You did have a little bit more comparison on those other rates with Washington, but again, you need to make sure that it's clear how you are drawing this comparison. Everything's, you organize and follow the structure, but you haven't explained what the inferences are, and that's problematic. It shouldn't be that confusing.